Good afternoon, and on behalf of Hudson Institute, I would like to welcome all of you who are here in person and those who joined us online. For the Strategic Technology and US-India Relationship Panel. This event is part of the Motwani Jadeja US-India Dialogue Series. I'm Aparna Pande, Director of Hudson's Initiative on the Future of India and South Asia. Founded in 1961 by strategist Herman Kahn, Hudson challenges conventional thinking and seeks to guide policymakers and global leaders in government, business, through a vigorous program of publications, conferences, briefings, and recommendations. 2 successive American presidential administrations have implemented initiatives focusing on strategic technology, ensuring it lies at the core of the US-India partnership. Under the Biden administration, the rubric was the US-India Initiative on Critical and Emerging Technologies, or iCET. And under the second Trump administration, it is called Transforming the Relationship Utilizing Strategic Technology, or TRUST. The aim under both appears to be to boost collaboration, not just between governments, but also academia, private sector, in areas such as defense, AI, semiconductors, quantum, biotech, energy, and space. To discuss the opportunities in front of both countries in this sphere, we have an excellent panel with us today. To my immediate left, physically, not ideologically, Lisa Curtis is Senior Fellow and Director of the Indo-Pacific Security Program at the Center for a New American Security. Prior to joining CNAS, Lisa served as Deputy Assistant to the President and National Security Council Senior Director for South and Central Asia from 2017 to 2021. To Lisa's left, Lindsey Ford is a Senior Fellow at ORF America, where she leads the program on foreign policy and security. Prior to ORF America, Lindsey served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for South Asia at the National Security Council from 24 to 25. Jeff Brean is Program Manager for Technology Policy at ORF America. Jeff focuses on critical and emerging technologies, especially semiconductors and 5G. And to my extreme left, Dr. Daniel Markey is Senior Fellow, China and South Asia Program, Stimson Center. Prior to Stimson, he was Senior Advisor for South Asia at US Institute of Peace. I will start by asking each panelist for opening remarks around 5 minutes each, and then we'll move to a moderated discussion. Lisa, if I could ask you to go first.
Well, thank you very much, Aparna. It's great to be back here at the Hudson Institute. It was about a year ago to the day almost when we were talking about US-India technology cooperation. A lot has obviously changed since then, number one being that we have a new US president. But regarding US-India technology cooperation, I think we can already see that the Trump administration will sort of continue the trajectory that the Biden administration put the US-India tech relationship on, and it will continue to be a central pillar of the relationship. And there is strong incentive for the US and India to cooperate on technology, to diversify supply chains, reduce dependencies on China, providing other countries alternatives and options, because the threat of China dominating in these emerging and critical technologies is real. And it motivates both India and the United States to find ways to cooperate. There are many other reasons. There's a lot of synergy in terms of business connections, in terms of India's human capital, and their mutual interest in expanding this relationship. But I think we have to acknowledge that right now, a lot of the strategic tech cooperation that's happening is being driven by China. So during the first Trump administration, where Aparna mentioned I was at the NSC, the issue of technology competition was sort of just coming into focus. Much of the discussion at the time was on 5G telecommunications and the conundrum that we faced that China was dominating in the 5G market, doing end-to-end 5G installations throughout the Indo-Pacific region. The other issue was China's increasing dominance in controlling undersea cable infrastructure. China's smart cities were proliferating really across the globe. So it was becoming increasingly clear that the U.S. had to step up its game in the technology competition. And I think, we saw some of the early export controls coming on with Huawei and ZTE being sanctioned under the first Trump administration, and sort of escalating or accelerating discussions with allies and partners. I've been thinking too much about the India-Pakistan crisis, hence the word escalation, but we'll say elevating discussions with allies and partners about technology. And with India, the Trump administration really started discussions, this is the first Trump administration, on the 5G issue in late 2018, 2019. And they were initially, not very easy discussions, because at the time India was still weighing the economic benefits of going with cheaper Chinese technology versus more expensive other European 5G technology. And it wasn't really until the 2020 India-China border crisis that we really saw India's position on the 5G issue crystallize. And that summer, they did not permit Chinese companies to participate in their 5G trials. So this was also a time when the US technology majors, Google, Meta, then Twitter, now X, were making massive investments in India. There had been concerns about India's data protection, data localization efforts, and we still see some of those concerns, but some of those issues have been ironed out to a large degree. So I think what we see is tech cooperation will continue to be an area of focus for the second Trump administration when it comes to India. We saw this during Prime Minister Modi's February 13th visit to the White House, where they unveiled the Trust Initiative that Aparna raised. Of course, the initiative is about catalyzing both government and private sector collaboration in defense technologies, AI, semiconductors, quantum, biotech, energy, and space. And as part of the US-India roadmap on accelerating AI infrastructure, they will examine how to scale up AI infrastructure in India. The two countries have committed to working together to enable industry partnerships and investments in data centers, and will continue to address controls and protections of technologies that are necessary for this cooperation. The leaders also announced the launch of Indus Innovation, which is really building upon the Indus X platform started during the Biden administration, which I'm sure Lindsey will talk more about. But they committed sort of across the board to continue technology cooperation. They talked about critical minerals cooperation. And so I think, the future looks pretty good. We're early days in the Trump administration, but I think we can see that the discussion on technology will remain very rich, and I think we have a lot to look forward to.
Thanks, Lisa. Lindsey, if I could turn over to you.
Thanks, Aparna. And thank you to you for the event, and to Hudson for the invite. So in reflecting on, I guess, maybe picking up the story where Lisa left off, I think the Biden administration did inherit an important conversation about the changing nature of technology competition between the United States and Beijing. And where that conversation started on telecoms, which was an important piece of the puzzle, I think as the Biden administration entered office, we took a look and really grew increasingly concerned that beyond telecoms, what you were seeing was Beijing really making major investments in frontier technologies in a range of areas. So whether that was artificial intelligence, edge computing, quantum, we were seeing the Chinese make huge research bets that in some cases were creating real vulnerabilities for the United States and our allies. that issue, some of the supply chain issues that were also, inherent to it, I think became clearer in particular after COVID, when supply chains as a whole got very snarled, and it made the country, and it certainly made the government, reflect on the degree to which we probably had real bottlenecks and vulnerabilities, and having those vulnerabilities be in Beijing's hands was a real problem for the United States. So we started looking at what to do about that, and a central element, I think, of the Biden administration's foreign policy was not only trying to increase some of our own domestic investments at home, and you saw that with the CHIPS Act most notably, but also looking at a concept, what we referred to essentially as friendshoring. And that was where could we make bets on reducing supply chain vulnerabilities and really trying to counter some of that technology competition with Beijing in like-minded countries. That, I think, brings us to the iCET story, because it was pretty clear if you are concerned about really a competition between, I think, democratic and autocratic systems, and you recognize that technology is a key element of how you wage that competition, it becomes clear that to counter at scale what Beijing is doing, you actually really needed the United States and India working together. Not only because our economies are very complementary, but because you also just nowhere else have the degree of knowledge and human capital needed, as well as the potential manufacturing capability to actually provide an alternative for countries in the Indo-Pacific, but globally, to what you see happening in Beijing. So our sense was that not only was the moment ripe for more of a conversation between the United States and India on technology cooperation, but that as we thought about what our strategy was going to be on the technology side, we really couldn't do that without the United States and India working more closely together. And so I think that's really where the genesis of iCET came from. Then I guess 2 points about both how we tried to execute that initiative and what we thought was necessary to make it work, and also how we thought about the outcomes. So on the point about how to make it work, for anyone who has worked on the US-India relationship for a long time, you know that one of the greatest challenges is not our ambition. We often have lofty ambition, befitting our two huge, boisterous democracies, and then it oftentimes really falls apart in the execution because we have huge, unwieldy, ponderous bureaucracies that are also quite different. And so sometimes trying to sort of get those initiatives going is exceedingly difficult and very slow. So we made the decision that for iCET to be something different, we needed to centralize it at the National Security Council and with the NSCS on the Indian side, very intentionally. And we needed to lead it from the top down, and that was why we had the national security advisors in charge. And that was not only so we could set direction for our bureaucracies, but also so we could try to generate results more quickly, because we could leverage the center of the system to try to pull things forward and knock down barriers more effectively than if you simply said to one agency within the US government or the Indian government, go forth and do technology cooperation. That was, I think, an important part of iCET, because in many, many instances, whether it was some of the cooperation we did on jet engines, work we were doing working to help with licensing, on civil nuclear cooperation, on semiconductor chips, it honestly required the White House and the NSCS on the Indian side forcing our bureaucracies to get in line. And then the last thing I would say is just to point out how we thought about outcomes when it came to iCET. I think a lot of times when you have a gov-to-gov initiative, the outcome is like, we have a brand new policy, or some kind of government document. That was very intentionally not what we were after with iCET. And how we viewed the outcomes of iCET was, if we see private sector production initiatives or deals coming together, that is what we're trying to do. We are really trying to both break down barriers and also identify and pull forward opportunities that our private sectors were looking at to allow them to run faster and harder hand in hand with each other. And so that's why I think a lot of things that we did, whether again, that was enabling tech transfer for jet engines, talking about work on Stryker combat vehicles. Lisa mentioned Indus-X, which was the Defense Innovation Initiative. And really the outcomes there were prize challenges for both Indian and US startups to work together to solve military problems, or some of the work we did on semiconductor investments in foundries, including an investment in India's first national security semiconductor foundry in India, enabled by tech transfer from the United States Space Force. That was really the focus of what we were after with iCET. I think there is certainly much more to be done. I'm very happy that the second Trump administration is taking that work forward. And I think hopefully they can continue to maybe make iCET not only ambition, but more reality in the future.
Thanks, Lindsey. Jeff, over to you.
Sure. Everyone can hear me okay. Dr. Pande, thank you so much for the kind invitation, and I'm honored to be joined by such esteemed panelists. I'll give a brief overview of where I'm headed. Happy to talk more in the Q&A as well. But first, one top-line comment on the aspects of cooperation, and then I'll talk about semiconductors, which is one of my areas of focus, and then transition into defense tech cooperation, as I've been asked to provide some specific examples to sort of put some texture to the cooperation that Lisa and Lindsey have described. The first thing I want to highlight, and Lindsey alluded to this, governments can point the direction for where they want tech cooperation to go, and I'm talking about governments generally in the cooperation bilaterally or minilaterally through things like the Quad, iCET and Trust, even things like I2U2 or the US-EU Trade and Technology Council. Governments can point the way, but ultimately private sector is the one that's responsible for implementing a number of these things in a practical way. And private sector does think about geopolitical dynamics and risk, but they also respond to market factors. And it's pretty important when you start to think about tangible examples of technology cooperation in this context of the US and India. We heard about the challenges that the US government was grappling with and the Indian government with respect to right shoring and the mid-pandemic supply chain shortages of chips, which galvanized, I think, this focus, at least certainly on the US government side. But I will say that in the context of iCET, on the commercial side, I think some of the semiconductor achievements are slightly overstated, and I'll explain why. It's worth noting that India has, in the past, attempted to attract commercial semiconductor investment on 3 previous occasions and struggled to do so. So the India Semiconductor Mission is sort of the latest attempt to do this, and I think it's been by far the most successful, but it still faces challenges. It's worth noting that within the semiconductor industry more broadly, you have to remember, as this audience may know, it's highly capitally intensive. It requires deep knowledge and experience in terms of actually conducting fabrication and back-end packaging. It benefits from clustering effects. And there are many prerequisites on the infrastructure side that countries have to have in place in order to be successful. And this includes things like power and water, among other things. Happy to get into that. So as Lindsey explained, under the context of the iCET, following the announcement in May 2022, there was this happy synergy between the fact that within a couple months of the announcement, the Chips and Science Act would become law here in the United States in August of 2022. And just a few months beforehand, in the prior year, Prime Minister Modi had announced the ISM. And so there was a unique government push, I think, for these two things to come together. But I would highlight that the 2 Semiconductor Industry Association here in the United States, as well as iCET, the Indian equivalent, were brought together. They agreed to conduct a feasibility assessment. The independent assessment was conducted by a good friend of mine, a guy named Stephen Azell, who I've co-authored a few pieces with on retaining U.S. semiconductor leadership. I would encourage you guys to check it out. But ultimately, I thought the assessment, which was released in February of 2024, was really aggressive in terms of the where it laid out that India could focus on back-end packaging as well as on mature node legacy chip fabrication. And also highlighted some of the concerns that U.S. and Western companies face when they look to invest in India with respect to chips specifically. Let's talk a little bit about specific examples. So the one tangible example, which Lindsey alluded to, is the Micron investment for a back-end packaging facility for memory in Sunam, Gujarat. It's a $2.75 billion project, of which India's center will cover about 50% of the cost. The state of Gujarat will cover about 25%, and then Micron itself is kicking in about $825 million. This is a significant investment and a real tangible win on the commercial side for collaboration. But again, it's on the back end and it's for memory. So just keep that in mind in thinking through this. The other type of example I want to point to, there's a couple programs on the commercial side. Lam Research, for example, has pulled together its Semiverse training platform, which they started with a pilot program to offer Indian citizens the opportunity to train on a virtual platform for semiconductor design and tools. And this has been scaled up. And I would point to it as another highly successful example of practical cooperation. On the ISM, outside of US involvement, they managed to attract 4 or 5 credible investments with actual semiconductor know-how and experience in Gujarat and Assam. We can talk more about the new announcement in UP if you like, after some early struggles. But I want to highlight the gulf in capital scale that we're talking about here. One company in the United States, Intel, will receive about $8 billion for commercial fabrication, new foundry development in the United States. That $8 billion US dollars is roughly equivalent to the entirety of the budget, roughly, that India has set aside for its ISM at the center. Quickly transitioning over to defense and semiconductors, I wanted to highlight one project with Lindsey and I were talking about the other day. Third Eye Tech has reached a joint venture with General Atomics to produce and design semiconductor chips for precision-guided munitions and some other weapon systems, and that's another area of tangible cooperation. Finally, on defense tech, I think the flagship achievement is the General Electric HAL deal for the F414 afterburning jet engine, which will be utilized in the Tejas Mark II multi-role medium fighter. That is a really tangible agreement. Initially, I believe back in 2013 or 2014 timeframe, GE agreed to sell around 100 engines, 99 engines, to HAL. And then in 2023, in the context of growing collaboration, HAL and GE reached a co-production agreement and technology transfer agreement, which is a really big deal. Manufacturing jet engines is really hard. Manufacturing afterburning military spec jet engines is even harder. So that's another tangible area of cooperation. Lastly, I'll just highlight Raytheon and Boeing have reached an agreement with Tata to produce components for Apache attack helicopters, Stinger missile systems, very important. And as somebody else, I think maybe Lisa mentioned under the Trump-Modi joint statement, we heard that there may be progress on co-production of Javelins, anti-tank guided missile systems, and Stryker armored personnel carriers. So I'll stop there and turn it over to others.
Thanks, Jeff. Dan, over to you.
Great, thanks, Aparna. Thanks to the rest of the panelists. It's been great so far. So as now I remember, a year ago, Aparna invited me to be on a panel then. I was supposed to be the skunk at the party. She's asked me to do the same thing again. So I will do my best. Let me begin, and by that I only mean that I'm supposed to ask hard questions about what's already going on, not actually be the skunk. So what's to focus on here? Look, she wants me to talk about kind of the big picture overview, which I can do, and I think my fellow panelists have already done a great job of that. And then opportunities, but also pitfalls and challenges ahead. And I think Jeff got into some really interesting ones in what he was talking about, at least pitfalls and challenges. But let me begin with the overview by saying it would be something like massive strategic malpractice by the United States not to want to do a lot of the things that we've been talking about with India. So this is a very important and increasingly important strategic partnership. I hope it continues to be that way. And in all of these areas, we see tremendous promise, but starting from a relatively low base. So India has the scale. I think Lindsey was talking about. At some level, there is a scale issue in terms of just simply population size and numbers of people who can be involved in these types of activities. India can, in certain instances, be an interesting solution to the so-called +1 problem or supply chain diversification challenge of moving away from just being so reliant upon China. And India's young population offers potential productivity gains that we don't see in many other parts of the world. So in all of these ways, it's really important to recognize India's not like, say, some of the aging countries of Europe. It has not got a stagnant economy like much of the rest of the world. Increasingly, we see places like China as being strategically challenging, and so overdependence on them is also problematic. India has to be a part of our geoeconomic strategy going forward. So we've talked about friend shoring, and here, particularly in things like pharma, This is really important. Now, we've learned after COVID how important having India and potentially really working with India to build up capacity that brings them closer to us would be. Supply chain diversification, talked about kind of these legacy semiconductors, things that are maybe not cutting edge, but still important, and we need volume of them, and India may be an important provider there. We haven't really touched, I don't think, too much on civil nuclear cooperation, but that is an area where I think there's great opportunity, or at least considerable opportunity, because India really needs reliable energy supply, and this is something that if we can work on it together, particularly small modular reactors, this is something potentially a growth area of cooperation. And then my favorite has always been in research and education, where we, the United States, have been a world leader, and India really needs a great deal more of education and research, and collaboration there is essential. Okay, so those are all really big things that we can do more of together. Pitfalls. Number one, the pitfall of overstatement. I'm not suggesting any of my panelists have done this, but there is a tendency to overstate the scale of, say, trade with India or investment with India. I think, Jeff, you were pointing at this. I mean, you're talking about a comparison between investment in Intel here in the United States and overall scale of a similar industry in India. This is important to recognize, right? We can't overpromise here. We shouldn't misrepresent what is actually underway. There's a couple of good news stories that we often use as kind of taglines: iPhone production in India, Micron deal. These are good things, no doubt. But it's iPhone assembly. It's not complete, construction, more or less. And as you pointed out, it's Micron memory, right? So there are limits to what we're talking about here. We don't want to misrepresent even the good news stories. And there is a question of prioritization as well. And by that, I mean, where does India stack up in terms of India's cooperation with other friends and partners in the world, and where ought it to? So no doubt we should do more, but shouldn't we also be doing a great deal more with Canada, with Mexico, with Europe, with our ASEAN partners? Yes, 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 yes. So where does India really fit in terms of what should it demand in terms of prioritization and focus by any administration? Challenges. Let's see two kind of general types of challenges. One, Jeff got into a bit, and Lindsey also referred to, which is kind of the implementation challenge. Lots of good ambition falls by the wayside if you can't actually get it through either the bureaucracies or the businesses themselves. There is a question of ease of doing business in India. This persists. It's not just a perception problem, though there is a perception problem, but the perception is founded on concerns about logistics, moving things around India, moving things out of India, making sure that there's plenty of energy to supply the various factories and other facilities in India. These are all continue to be challenges. So that's one type of challenge. The second type, a little more complicated, I would describe as sort of structural and policy challenges. So in the US, I would put President Trump's tariffs in this category. This is unhelpful, I think, broadly to the US-India relationship. The strategy of reshoring rather than friendshoring, though certainly some of that is necessary, but too much reshoring will hurt US-India partnership and will not be helpful there. Again, very importantly, denying resources or threatening the resources of America's higher education institutions and research institutions will be fundamentally detrimental to our ability to partner, not just with India, but to our success in all of these things that we've been talking about. So these are real dangers that I see. Add to that, Lisa pointed out that a big driver of the US-India strategic tech partnership is China. Where does this administration actually stand on China? What is its policy on China? To what extent is our competition with China likely to continue to drive us to see India as an important strategic partner? Or are we heading in a different direction in our relationship with China? And the question mark that lingers over that question will threaten US-India relations. Okay, on India's side, I already talked about infrastructure, but this is important on things like secure data and technology. You really need, why do we not do more on AI with India? It's not just because we don't want to. It's because there are still lingering concerns about the security of their data, and that's why the Biden administration classified India as it did. There are these trade logistic issues, And there are fundamental human capital issues, right? The education of India's young people will be the difference between whether they are a force for greater productivity and an enabler for India to actually accomplish and be a real competitive power in these high-tech sectors, or will be stuck in a kind of a stagnant developing status rather than a developed status. And last point, we talked about trust. Well, is there now a trust deficit? We are sitting here in the aftermath of yet another India-Pakistan crisis, in which at this moment, I think many Indians are questioning the nature of whether they should trust the United States, and in particular, in strategic ways when it comes to defense technologies. When push came to shove, India will have some questions, not least because they are very, at least at the moment, very unhappy with the Trump administration in terms of how it managed at least the diplomacy of the management of this crisis, and how it got out ahead of the Modi government, and how in many Indian minds it made India look like it was being forced to capitulate in ways that are very uncomfortable and unwelcome. That is not the kind of thing that builds trust. At the same time, when India thinks and Indians think about the things that delivered to them security, at least some of them will be looking at air defense systems, which were not manufactured by the United States, but were actually a bone of contention with the United States because they came from Russia. And then last point, we talked about iCET at least being a national security advisor to national security advisor, top-down, very intense, focused priority for the Biden administration. Will a dual-hatted Secretary of State and National Security Advisor be able to carry that water? I suspect not. We need a policy and a focus to unlock the doors that we're talking about, and that needs to be, I would say, remedied pronto. So let me leave it there.
Thank you, Dan. Some of the points you raised, I'm actually going to throw back at all of you. So thank you for raising the excellent questions, including the India-Pakistan one, which I know I've had people send me emails and ask if we could somewhere in our Q&A we could bring that up. But let me start from the beginning. So I'll pose the question to all of you, and feel free to jump in and add what you would like and to contradict the others or disagree with them. So if we talk about strategic tech, all of you know that access to high-end strategic American technology has long been a goal of Indian state, going back decades. And there are many in India who believe that for a long time, India was denied access. For various reasons, we can agree to disagree on why, and to certain civilian and defense technologies. All of you have made the argument that the China factor has played a role in successive American administrations viewing India as a country that the US would be comfortable with sharing some of these strategic high-end technologies, even though there are challenges that we can discuss. Moving forward, I know we are still few months into the Trump administration only, but moving forward, what would each of you see as, a sign that this administration is going to take it, despite the acronym TRUST, is actually going to move forward on strategic tech cooperation with India? And what would each of you see as something which worries you that maybe it's just going to be an acronym, it's actually not going to, move forward except in, deliverables at summits? I'll start with Lisa.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think if I think about things that concern me, I would build on what Dan was talking about in terms of the recent India-Pakistan crisis. I just published an article in Foreign Affairs on this issue on Tuesday, focusing more on the statements that Trump is making about wanting to mediate the territorial dispute over Kashmir between the two countries, which is like the third rail in Indian political discourse. This is something that India fights against, having any mention of Kashmir in international fora or any hint of international involvement in the Kashmir issue. The opposite is true for Pakistan. Pakistan is constantly trying to focus international attention to get the U.S. to commit to mediation. And unfortunately, I think Trump's tweets have been fueling this. And I think right now, Indian officials, recognize that Trump tweets a lot of things. He exaggerates. You have to sometimes read between the lines and can't take everything literally. But I think if he continues down this path, or even actually genuinely tries to meddle or intervene in the Kashmir issue, that could definitely send a chill through U.S.-India relations. So I think that's one thing I'm worried about. The other is the civil nuclear issue. I know that India has put forward new legislation to overcome the nuclear liability issue, but I still am concerned. This has been a long-standing bone of contention between the U.S. and India. The fact that the civil nuclear deal happened, in 2008. At the time, U.S. companies were told, they would have hundreds of billions in investment in India's civil nuclear industry, which never happened because of the nuclear liability law. Well, now it looks like the BJP government may be moving forward on that front, but I'm still a bit skeptical. And if that becomes sort of a litmus test on the U.S. side, there could potentially be some disappointment. And I would also just build on something that Dan said about the Trump administration's commitment to a strategy of strategic competition with China. I think we're seeing a little bit of mixed messaging on that in terms of, is there some advisors in the Trump administration that focus more on a more isolationist foreign policy, non-interventionist, want to sort of pull back into internal issues. And that's in tension, I think, with some of the other advisors who very much want to continue a lot of the programs and activities that were done under the Biden administration that, frankly, were started in the first Trump administration. We shouldn't forget that it was the first Trump administration that had the Indo-Pacific strategic framework that President Trump signed in February 2018 and drove the Trump administration strategy toward China in the Indo-Pacific. And also it looked a lot like the Biden administration Indo-Pacific strategy. So it would certainly be a break with the first Trump administration if we did not see this focus on competing with China. But I would just put a pin in that issue because we've seen a few concerning things, but I'm not at the point where I'm pushing the panic button, because we've also seen things like the interim national defense strategy, which was leaked in the Washington Post, which looks like a very traditional sort of U.S. strategy toward China, and even looks like there would be an increase in the U.S. military posture in the Indo-Pacific, continuing to work with allies and partners. Secretary of Defense Hegseth made very good visits to Japan and the Philippines, reiterating our commitment to those alliances. So I think we're still seeing a large drive toward strategic competition with China, but things could change.
Lindsey?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts on the question of part of, what am I looking for on trust? So if you look at the February joint statement that the United States and India put out when PM Modi visited, it lays out a whole lot of stuff, pretty ambitious stuff, a lot of acronyms, right? And thus far, we're now in May, I don't know that I have seen or heard anything regarding progress on any of the initiatives that were laid out in there, and that concerns me. So what am I looking for? Well, there's apparently a new autonomy initiative. that really feels like, at this particular moment in time, something that probably India would want to move forward on and really want to prioritize. Yeah. Is anything happening? What kinds of unmanned systems are we talking about? I would want to see some kind of meat put on the bones of what this Asia initiative is supposed to look like. Beyond that, Indus Innovation, which is the follow-on from Indus X, is an element of iCET where I think we actually had very concrete things that were happening over the course of the Biden administration with joint challenges and other kind of work. What comes next in that? Is there more to follow? That's something else that I would be looking for. And then third, and this is probably the most difficult one in the near term for all of the reasons that Dan pointed out, is there going to be a trust meeting? And who's going to lead it? I will say, I think it was exceptionally hard to get the National Security Advisor to Delhi. I can tell you because on my last trip, we were there for all of 20 hours on the ground for iCET meetings. And that was under the best of circumstances when he really wanted to do it and we all really wanted to do it. It was hard. And so with a dual-hatted Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, and without the senior director underneath who's actually supposed to be running all the tech policy and kind of building it out, I'm not quite sure how that happens. So I guess kind of building on your point about concerns, the personnel piece really, really, really matters. It not only matters where you house it, and I would argue, having lived it, that trying to put this initiative at the State Department is not going to work because there are too many parts of the State Department that have very differing views on how they would like to handle various aspects of the India relationship or technology policy. It will not move quickly. But it also matters how many people you have in the National Security Council. I worked hand in hand with my counterpart, Tarun Chhabra. We both had teams underneath us, and I can tell you it was a day-to-day slog on things like any number of companies coming to you with here's my license that hasn't gotten approved. This AI initiative, no one can get visas. I mean, we're talking pretty tactical stuff that, to break it loose, was getting kicked up to pretty high levels of government. And so, Jeff, I think this is one reason when you say, what has happened and have things moved and we only have a few things to point to. Yes, we need to recognize that it's still a really hard slog to get some of that stuff done. And if you don't have people who want to do it and get super jazzed about flogging their own bureaucracy to make it happen, it's really hard to get those initiatives off the ground. And then I guess the last point on what Lisa and Dan kind of said about the India-Pakistan crisis and what that means, and I very much agree with their comments. There is always going to be a crisis of the day that is going to throw sand in the gears when it comes to the US-India relationship. There always is. I mean, it's a lovely roller coaster that's strapping in for Space Mountain, and you never know what's coming next, and you're probably riding in the dark, but that is the way that it goes. And whether it is Prime Minister Modi going to Russia right in the middle of the NATO summit, or whether it is the way that the India-Pakistan crisis shook out, there will be another one. And you really, really have to have intention at the highest levels of your government on both sides to say, despite all of that, we're going to stay focused on the long-term goals and make this work. And if you don't, it becomes way too easy to just get caught up in whatever it is that one or the other has done that's made you really mad.
Mr. Bean?
Thanks. Yeah, just reflecting on the challenges on the personnel side, because I think that's something my other panelists are much better positioned to articulate. But I think the real, and also, of course, NSA and Secretary of State Rubio is also now the head of USAID too, right? Nominally, so he's got even more hats. Right, exactly, yes. So
but they don't have money anymore, so it makes it a lot easier to manage
that's true.
them.
Yeah, you can just check the box and then you're done. But the one thing I wanted to mention in the context of Lisa's comments that I agree with is that also President Trump in his first administration was also responsible for resurrecting the Quad as well at the very end of his time, and I think we should give a little bit of credit for that. Granted, it was at the ministerial level, but the Biden administration certainly took that and ran with it. In terms of things I'm looking for, I guess I think about this in the context of where does it go forward under trust. Like Lindsey, I haven't seen a whole lot of tangible progress, but it's early days. There's not that many folks in billet or in position in the government yet, so maybe some time is warranted. I'll talk a little bit about where I think this goes under the trust initiative. To me, the thing that I'm looking for is to what extent can the United States and India advance the ball on AI cooperation, and that feeds into both advanced compute. I talked about chips earlier, but also AI infrastructure. So that's data centers, that's the ability to power data centers, that's the ability to cool them, which are sort of related to some of the infrastructure concerns that exist with semiconductor manufacturing as well. But that's also connectivity, that's high-speed broadband, and other hardware infrastructure at both the core and the edge that need to be mentioned. It's ironic, today's May 15th. Today was the day that the Biden administration's AI diffusion framework was supposed to go into effect, that they announced the final week of the administration before Trump's inauguration. The Commerce Department earlier this week acted on what many long expected and rescinded the rule. Important to understand that from India's perspective, of course, India was placed in tier 2 of this arrangement, along with notable enemies like Singapore, Israel, Poland, Portugal, Switzerland, and a number of other countries that you would tend to think of as U.S. friends. But because of the way the Biden administration constructed the rules, they were hoping to limit GPU sales to countries that had smuggling concerns or leakage concerns with respect to advanced GPUs. I think India is very happy that they rescinded the rule, but we don't know what's going to follow. And in India's case, it may ultimately be beneficial if it's more of a bilateral arrangement. We'll see what Commerce decides to go to. But at the end of the day, I still think there will be some challenges on that front on the AI build-out. We haven't talked about the bilateral trade agreement that is theoretically happening. I think that will have an important role. Maybe Dan, if you can maybe offer some thoughts on that. But both countries clearly committed under trust to build out the full scope of the AI stack. They talked about the roadmap. Their dialogues going on to try to figure out how to build that out. In my view, that has 4 parts. One is the AI infrastructure piece of this that includes the GPUs, but it also includes the connectivity required and the expertise and investment necessary to do that. It also includes joint research. The joint statement specified another NSF, Indian National Research Foundation agreement to build on previous NSF announcements under the iCET with various Indian national science agencies. So that joint research is important, but is NSF going to get to play? That's not entirely clear. The next one is domains and applications. It's important to remember that I think from an Indian perspective, there's this desire that AI is leveraged to provide wide societal gains across the board. And that may be a little bit different from how U.S. companies tend to think about this. So I think that's an important one. And the last one on what am I looking for is people. What are the training and skilling opportunities that are provided within India to support this? How can U.S. companies and U.S. nonprofits support this? What does the mobility and immigration situation look like to allow talented people to move back and forth? And lastly, what are the opportunities within India to alter or slowly change the curriculums for training?
Thank you. Dan, before you respond to my sort of broader question to the rest of the panel, I have a slightly different one for you. Since you put forth a number of, sort of points in your original remarks, I'll tweak the question and ask you differently. I'll say, while there have been those on the Indian side who felt India was denied access, there are some on the US side who say, why is India sharing? Why is US sharing strategic technology with India? Is the US repeating what it did with maybe China decades ago? And sort of, is that going to create challenges for the US in the coming decades as it did with China? Would you sort of, what response would you give to those who say that?
Right. Okay. So I will answer that question, I promise. But I wanted to say some nice things first in terms of ways in which this administration and India seem to put India at the front of the line and get off to a hot start right from the get-go, right? So you had Quad meetings, Modi visit, these have been mentioned. One thing that was noteworthy, even about this crisis, even as maybe it has ended on a sour note in terms of our relationship, during the crisis, there seemed to be a lot of back and forth a lot of picking up the phone by India to our Secretary of State. That has not always been the case. They don't always respond with alacrity when they don't want to hear what we have to say. And they're not always sharers. And that has been a past pattern. And this is very healthy and I think kind of impressive. So we shouldn't lose sight of that. You mentioned the bilateral trade agreement. This is another area where India put itself at the front of the line with the expectation that, yes, there's going to be limited bandwidth, even under the best of circumstances, for the United States to conclude trade agreements with lots of different countries, and we're in the midst of exactly that. So you better get to the front of the line, and India did that. So that kind of initiative and kind of an acceleration of the process, I hope it wasn't purely a reflection of the impulse of our now former National Security Advisor, who clearly had an interest in working with India closely and prioritizing that relationship. I hope it reflects a kind of a broader perspective, but time will tell on that. Look, you've asked a very different, in a sense, a very different question. A much longer term strategic question about, more like the 30-year time frame, something like that, at least 20 years. Will we come to regret any of the things that we might do with India in the near term? Because they will, in retrospect, have look like we're giving away the crown jewels, or we're advancing their interests over ours, or we are otherwise sort of setting ourselves back. It is possible, and the way that I think about this is to ask a related question, which is, what will the India of 20 years want to do with the things that we might have worked with it on? Because that was the question that we ought to have asked with the Chinese, right? And by the way, to the extent that we asked it, people had very different answers on that. There were some fairly rosy expectations for the nature of how China would develop, and there are some very dark expectations. So I don't have a pure answer for you, but only to say that the same questions need to be asked. And when we think about the China case, to the extent that it's analogous, we now, in retrospect, say, well, what was it about the Chinese system that ultimately, basically from the inside, led them to be ultimately a serious competitor, possibly a hostile adversary, certainly problematic in terms of American primacy decades later? Are there things about India that would incline it to that? Not off the bat, but conceivably. Are there things that may make India very clearly interested in its independence, its autonomy, its own greatness, and maybe will always make it less inclined to be a partner of the United States? Yeah, that's more plausible. And are there things that will incline it naturally to be a close, respected, and peaceful partner of the United States? Maybe. So simple answers, but big question, and it's exactly the kind of work we should be doing.
Thank you. I'll turn to the audience now, and please raise your hand if you have a question. Wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation before the question.
Thank you. Is it on? Thanks to the panel and to Aparna for gathering a truly distinguished panel. I'd like to try to ask a big question that's been all but explicitly raised in this discussion. But I go back to the nuclear deal, which Lisa raised, and when I first met you on the Hill. I recall at the time, strategic altruism was kind of the guiding ideal. But that's not persuasive for, say, members of Congress. So I recall Ron Summers coming up to the Hill every week and promising hundreds of thousands of American jobs and great sales for Westinghouse. Maybe this helped push it over the top. But again, India watchers knew that there was something different going on, bringing greater trust to the relationship. So now we're 20 years later. Stimson had an event a couple months ago where an Indian diplomat presented on nuclear cooperation, kind of reborn. And at the end, I felt like it was very clear what India was getting out of it, and not at all clear what the United States was getting out of it. And then today, in hearing you go across in your opening kind of presentation, mentions of a new national security foundry, semiconductors, Dan, you said something about, India's energy needs and how much that would be important. I kind of wonder again, and I have to, for my clients, I have to have some kind of answer for what is the United States getting out of this? I mean, are we still in a kind of an era of strategic altruism thinking? And we might guess that the new president is not looking at the world through a lens of strategic altruism. So what is the United States getting out of this entire endeavor? Thank you.
Open to the panel.
Yeah, well, look, I think this is a bit different. We're talking about U.S.-India technology cooperation. I do see differences than the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal and kind of the direction that that went in. I think that, we can see tangible benefits. Like we're talking about the tie-up between U.S. Space Force and Third Eye Tech, which is making semiconductors for munitions, weaponry, and the idea is that eventually it could even benefit the U.S. and U.S. industry. So it's part of the looking at working with allies and partners to be able to overcome shortages that have become evident, say in the Ukraine-Russia war. So that's one kind of small example, but I think that we can see sort of the tangible joint benefits when you're looking at technology cooperation and the fact that India has this huge tech talent, human capital. This is also synergistic when you're talking about cooperation between the two. And I think also if we look at what's happened in just the last few years, you had a major India-China border crisis, very much in the U.S. interest to see India be able to defend its borders. There was a lot of support for India, and I think that's in the U.S. interest. I think we want India to be able to stand up to China, to have those capabilities. And that sets an example for the rest of the region. When India is able to stand its ground with China and say, well, we're not going back to normalization until you return your troops to the pre-May 2020 status quo, and then sticks by that, that's good. China was not able to change facts on the ground through force, and that shows the rest of the region a good example of that. So I do think that the U.S. gets something out of increasing its technology cooperation with India, its defense cooperation. India has a lot of soft power in the region. This is also valuable when you're talking about countering Chinese influence in the region. So I frankly see this as different than the U.S.-India civil nuclear issue. Where, yes, if you looked at it just, this is important for trust, but even then, it's not as if the U.S.-India defense trade relationship catapulted forward either. I mean, yes, it's grown, it's over 20 billion, close to 25 billion. It's good, it's growing, but I think if you go back and you think about what the U.S.-India civil nuclear deal was supposed to do in terms of massively improving trust and leading to massive defense deals, civil nuclear deals, it definitely didn't turn out that way.
Yeah, if I could just quickly come back to the narrow issue of nuclear cooperation. No, I know, but I like it because as I was thinking through, if we can get by the liability issues and if we can get into some work on these modular reactors, some of your constituents will like that because that should mean that some tech providers here in the United States who actually own the intellectual property associated with that and be involved in manufacturing would get ahead, so there's money to be made. And if you can do it at scale, which is sort of the whole thing in India, then costs come down, and this becomes a viable energy technology beyond India, and that's very good for our companies who would be involved in that. And for a different segment of your constituents, they would actually care that you were weaning India off coal and that you were addressing climate change realities. And that would be a very positive thing as well. So that's a very narrow issue, but you can kind of broaden it out and say there are money-making opportunities, and India is so big that anything that you would do there that would be successful for energy, for climate, for health, and many other issues as well would immediately affect a sixth of humanity or so, and would have a major positive knock-on effect as well.
Yeah, so I think, because yes, I've heard this question in talking to colleagues on the Hill, and it's fair. What does the United States get out of all of this? And I think for me, there is both a commercial answer to that question, certainly when we're talking about technology and defense, and there's a strategic answer to that question, but they both matter. From a commercial perspective, let's take SMRs and nuclear cooperation. Absolutely, there is just a pure market piece of this, that if US companies can get into India, especially at a moment when you have US tech companies trying to throw up data centers all over India, which are going to need a whole lot more energy to make those work, well, that is a money-making opportunity. And when you have a market that is as large as the Indian market, it's a lot of money, potentially. That is one reason why I think where this bilateral trade agreement lands is going to matter on a lot of fronts. The second piece of this, and this was certainly something we thought about a lot about on the defense side as we were looking at some of the co-production initiatives, is it's not just about selling into the Indian market, but it's a lot of times what we can produce in India that also flows back this way, right? I think 30+% right now of Indian defense manufacturing is actually flowing back into the United States. And for companies like Lockheed and like Boeing, they're not just doing that altruistically. It makes business sense for them. Lisa mentioned the Third Eye Tech Space Force agreement. Space Force came and talked to me about this, and I love this example because it makes it so abundantly clear why we should do these things. I was like, okay, tell me why you care about any of this. What they said to me is like, look, these guys are talking about a certain kind of chip that has unique military applications that we need. And their startup, which has been around for all of 4 years, has more designers who know how to make that chip than we have in the entirety of the United States right now. So for Space Force, that collaboration was incredibly important. And that's just one example, but there are lots more like that. And then at the strategic level, yes, India has been Russia's largest overseas arms market for a long time. And so there were all kinds of things that I think as people talked about how to, sort of weaken Russia's defense industrial base that to me were like really small ball, very small things. The big game is over the long run, weakening the overseas markets that Russia has available. And I think Indian defense diversification, which is a trend that we have seen for a long time, is a key part of that story, and we should care about that in the United States. And it's true when it comes to China, too. Who are countries in Southeast Asia going to go to for SMRs, which they are actively looking for right now? If they don't get it from the United States, potentially something that we can even produce in India, they're going to get it from China, and they're going to get it from Russia, because those are the only other games in town.
Real quick to respond, one thing for our work at ORF America, we spend a lot of time thinking about the global South, and India is in a unique position to advocate in some ways for perspectives that might be more in alignment with what the United States might want on a certain issue than, say, the Chinese. And I think that's a pretty critical point for U.S. engagement and the benefits of sustaining U.S.-India engagement. Last point, I thought of this in the context, I don't think I mentioned this earlier, but from what do we get out of it on the U.S. side, at least in the semiconductor industry, it's important to note that India has a huge design presence. Roughly 20% of the world's semiconductor designers are operating in Mumbai or Bangalore, right? So they have Qualcomm, NVIDIA, AMD, MediaTek, all of the major Broadcom, all the major fabless companies have design houses in India. So when you set aside the manufacturing challenges that I alluded to earlier because of the infrastructure barriers in India, there's still an important foundation to play But there's not a major, interestingly enough, there's not a major Indian semiconductor design company, and that has more to do with the market dynamics and the education limitations within those environments. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Young man.
Thank you for having this panel, and good to see you, Dan. So you guys mentioned the importance of trust in this relationship, and how it took a long time to build this trust, and how trust can be weakened as well. And the way that I've seen it is that there has been, even though tactical doubts about how this relationship could move forward, either on how a certain deal may be carried out, or how a previous deliverable may actually be delivered or not. There was at least a leader level commitment to this kind of U.S.-India relationship. With what we've seen over the last week, and this is of course a very small period of time, so keeping that in mind, that if there are continuous demonstrations of a lack of trust in this bilateral relationship, does this threaten previously achieved agreements like this GE deal or semiconductor deals that have already been that has already been pushed? Things that we've said that we have achieved, are they at risk of backsliding? And as a corollary onto this, that if these risks are apparent, is it better for a U.S.-India relationship to, rather than focus on linking a lot of the technological environments together, to just do capacity building instead, if this is going to be a lower trust relationship?
Who would like to take it?
I'll start real quick. I was thinking about this in the context of your question as well, Dr. Pande. One of the things, if anybody sat in on U.S.-India technology conferences and Track 1.5s, a quote I've heard a number of times or articulated is, if you give us technology as India, we will trust you. And if you're the United States, from the U.S. perspective, if we trust you and you're a defense ally and intelligence partner, then we will give you technology. And India's experience, we mentioned Russia and the Soviet Union, there was a lot more tech transfer in that engagement. So perceptions about how technology cooperation work are a little bit different, I think, culturally in that respect. And so in terms of how that plays out, I'll comment specifically. I don't think that broader leader-level geopolitical dynamics are necessarily going to impact commercial investments that firms choose to make, whether they're from the United States or you're Renzias in Japan, or you're one of the Taiwanese companies that has chosen to invest with Tata. I don't think that is going to derail that particular aspect of cooperation. But in a broader sense, I think it's potentially a concern.
Dan?
Here's the thing. Trust is what keeps the door open for the kinds of top-level conversations that unlock difficult agreements. Lacking trust is like throwing sand into the gears. Really, I'm not sure about reversing past decisions, but definitely slowing everything down. When we add that to what we've already described in terms of personnel and process, it's a deadly combination. And you can see just things kind of grinding to, if not a halt, it'll feel that way. And for those who are championing the relationship, trying to put a lot of energy into it, this is poisonous.
Yeah, I would just say, hopefully our remarks have not given the impression that there's this major trust deficit, or we're getting ready for a crash in U.S.-India relations, because I don't think that's the case. I think the Trump administration has made very clear that India is a priority. You've already had an early visit from Prime Minister Modi with President Trump. The Vice President was in India. Unfortunately, you had a horrific terrorist attack when he was there that, of course, has led to this crisis. And I talked about the potential pitfalls of Trump's continued harping on the mediation issue. But, I have confidence that there is enough of a history there in the relationship. And there's a history between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump. They have a lot of mutual respect for each other. So if we can get past this, or we can, have Trump maybe read my foreign affairs article and stop talking about mediation, then I think it will be okay. And there has been so much investment in this relationship at so many different levels on so many different issues that there is a very strong foundation there. And as Lindsey alluded to, there's always some kind of challenge that we're dealing with. I always think about the Devyani Kopakade affair, which was probably the worst that our relationship tanked in a long time, and that was what, 12 years ago or so. So we're nowhere in that kind of place with the U.S.-India relationship. I think it looks pretty good. We still have to see what happens with the trade deal. It's not going to be so easy. But my understanding is it's moved forward. As Dan said, India is sort of at the front of the line. I wouldn't be surprised to see if a trade agreement is reached fairly soon between the U.S. and India. So, I'm still very bullish on the relationship.
Would you like to comment?
Sure. I guess two things, and I agree with a lot of what's been said. One, I think when you have a conversation about trust in the U.S.-India context, for me, it was always really important to encourage people to step back and look at the longer time horizon of the relationship. Because I would argue, when you look at the longer time horizon of the relationship and where it has gone in the last 20 years, it is moving consistently in the same direction, right? But it's not a neat line graph. Right? It's like watching an EKG with a whole lot of ups and downs along the way. And if that's what you're focusing on, it can be really easy, I think, to feel like, well, maybe we shouldn't trust each other. But if you look at the trajectory, I think it gives you good reason that you should have more trust in the relationship. It's also why I just think, candidly, we need more people in both Delhi and in Washington who really invest a lot of time in this relationship, more US experts in India, more India experts in the United States, because quite frankly, given how important this relationship is, I think it's actually, these are all wonderful, wonderful, smart people here, right? But let's think about how many people there are in the United States that are India experts compared to how many people there are that are China experts. Right? And the same in Delhi. I go to Delhi and, there are great people, but we all probably talk to the same handful of people on every trip that we go on. To build trust, you need a lot more people working on this relationship, routinely talking to each other so that you have a richer, deeper understanding of each other's systems.
I agree. And just one point before I go to Rob is, one, what Lindsey said that, and that's the challenge you have here today. You have people on this panel who have done India for a very long time. And so you're going to get people delving into issues. If it was somebody who didn't work on India and was looking at the relationship, they would wonder, oh my God, where has it gone from? A non-aligned country, strategic autonomy, and yet the extent to which it is aligned with the United States today. Defense trade may not be very high, but considering it was
zero.
About,
2000.
Yeah. And so it is 25 billion today, the, bilateral relationship. So also, yes, this panel is discussing the pitfalls more than it's discussing the potential and what we've achieved, but that's only because we are India watchers, so we tend to focus, on the challenges rather than focusing on, if you want to, but, you can pick up any book, you can pick up any of our pieces and you'll find all the potential and all the opportunities out there. So, let's keep that in mind. Let's not focus only on the pitfalls and challenges, even though I know all of my questions have been focused on that. So I'll take, some of the blame for that as well. But no, I don't believe the India-Pakistan, tensions and skirmish and the response of this administration or the president is going to make a difference. Unless it consistently continues on a daily basis for a very long period of time, which I don't think it will. It's a news cycle, we'll get out of it, but the long term we may have to come back to right up front.
Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Walker. I work for the Air Force on Air Force modernization issues, but I'm a longtime India watcher as well. So as an Air Force guy, I'm very interested in reading all of the tit-for-tat, back-and-forth data on everything that happened over the weekend, over the past week, getting a lot of that and kind of interpreting what's going on in modern war. And I think that one of the aspects that we're seeing out of this in some of the early data, both the New York Times and the Washington Post had some kind of pretty good back and forth analysis of this. On the Chinese side, or on the Pakistani side, it was almost all Chinese equipment and it was all pretty well integrated. And so I'm sure China is now getting great data from all of that, from testing their equipment in a real world scenario. And on the US side, certainly, we are still kind of waiting for pictures of some of the data from the various systems and hoping that India will share it with us so we can get real-time images of what a J-10 looks like on a radar picture in a real-world combat situation as well. And I think some of the early indications are that because you have different systems that come from different countries, they struggled a little bit to be integrated in that real-world system. And so I'm both wondering, what are some things that the United States can work on in helping India integrate some of this stuff a little bit better? And then kind of at a broader step back picture on strategic technology overall, what do you think it is that kind of accounts for that gap between the potential in the relationship, especially in defense trade, and where we realize it? Is it because everyone sees that potential, everyone kind of ends up over-promising and over-delivering, maybe because we have so many leader-level visits, pretty much at least one every year, that we constantly see that? I mean, as we look at it, you go back even before 2000 when defense trade was zero, you go back to 1998 when we sanctioned India after the nuclear test, right? So I would really start the modern area in US-India relationship at 1998 and see where we've gotten there from there. Maybe it's because so many of us are, as you mentioned, so close to the relationship that we see all the things that took longer than happened, that we had to go at a fairly senior level to get the visas, to beg for a visa for a routine trip, whatever, that we see the struggle more than the long-term progress, and it is important to focus on that. But I'm wondering if you have, maybe from different eras in managing the US-India relationship, some perspective on that gap between over-promising and under-delivering, where even the under-delivering is still delivering quite a bit and a quite rapid trajectory in the relationship. Thanks.
Yeah, first let me say that in the 2019 Balakot crisis, when the Indian jet was shot down, it was shot down by an F-16 using a US-made AMRAAM missile. So, you know, the fact that this time it's Chinese equipment, you know, from an American perspective, that's probably more welcome. You know, we don't necessarily want U.S. equipment to be used against India. So, and there are specific, you know, regulations with that when the U.S. Has transferred F-16s and done F-16 upgrades for Pakistan. And I think you raised an interesting point about, so China is gathering data. It hasn't been in a wartime situation itself. So I'm sure it's very valuable for it to see how these planes and missiles are performing. But on the Indian side, I think, you know, India has always wanted to diversify its defense imports and rely on different countries for different things. I've always seen that as a bit of a risk because then, you know, you don't have the same kind of integration that you would have if you were relying on, you know, U.S. systems, for example. So I think there is a question there about how well integrated, you know, all of India's systems are. And they made a big decision when they went with the Rafale. You know, they turned down U.S. F-16s and FA-18s. So, you know, that's the decision that they made. But I think, you know, we have to recognize that when you diversify your imports from several different countries, there's obviously going to be an integration question there. So, you know, I would argue that India should import more U.S. defense and look to the U.S. The U.S. has the best equipment, the highest performing. And I understand India's desire to maintain its strategic autonomy, not be too dependent, its concerns about being sanctions, all of those things, understand. But there's also, I think, a cost to being too diversified with your military.
I mean, I think there's a lot of interesting questions from an Air Force perspective that come out of what just happened. Really fascinating ones that kind of, for the most part, I'm very much enjoying think tank life and not being in government again. As like a policy nerd, though, there are definitely the moments where you're like, oh man, I have so many questions I would love to be asking right now. But a few thoughts. One, there was already a real debate happening in Delhi about its Air Force modernization and a real sense that they're facing a fighter gap with Pakistan. And I cannot imagine that the last couple of weeks have made that better. So as India, right now, the challenge that they're facing, right, is that the AMCA, Indian 5th Gen, isn't going to show up for a period of some years in a best case DRDO sort of picture of what you think is going to happen. So there's a gap there that they're going to have to figure out how to either pull the AMCA forward or potentially look at acquiring 5th Gen from elsewhere. And to me, if I was looking at what just happened, I would want to have that conversation about, do we need to more seriously start looking at 5th Gen now? And should we be having that conversation with the United States? That's what I'd want to ask, because you're going to run another Markey competition. You're just going to have more 4.5 Gen that's also not going to show up for several years. Like, they need more capability and they need it now. The second thing to me is some interesting doctrinal questions, I think, about how is the Indian Air Force thinking about like manned-unmanned teaming in an aerial combat environment where they're going to be leveraging drone warfare heavily. That's the thing we haven't really seen before. And I would love to, I think, maybe have conversations between our air forces about, what does that look like? And that kind of leads me, I guess, to the last question is, what does that mean for US-India bilateral training? Because I suspect in all of the data that India is gathering about the last couple of weeks, there are probably some operational shortfalls that they weren't anticipating, some surprises in terms of how this played out. And I think you're going to have a much more realistic training environment for the United States and India, because going toe-to-toe with J-10s with Pakistani pilots is one thing. Going toe-to-toe with Beijing is an entirely different story.
One quick thing to add, I defer to my colleagues in terms of the military implications broadly, but I think if I was in India right now, I would probably regret not having picked up the phone to talk to my friends in Ukraine, who have had to integrate a wide variety of defense systems from all over the place in order to beef up their air defense and facing daily attacks and probes from Russian fixed-wing aircraft, manned aircraft, unmanned systems constantly. So I feel like it might be worth a call to Keith for that particular set of insights if there is this long-standing challenge about integrating different systems. On the gap side of things, most of my perspective is commercial in nature, and I think it requires both sides to look internally to try to improve the situation for the prospects for private sector investment. Talk about that offline if that's helpful.
Yeah, I would just say I agree with Lindsey. So many questions, not enough answers yet. But you're talking about a battlefield that just on first glance from public reporting included French, Chinese, Turkish, Israeli, Russian, and US to the extent that it was used F-16s equipment all together. I mean, what an interesting picture. And I would wonder, again, to Lindsey's points, if you're India, and BrahMos seem to factor in early and actually have some success. Is it the 5th generation? It's not an either or necessarily, but where is the weight of your investment going to go moving forward? When you're talking about dogfights that are taking place reportedly both behind the lines at really long distance, why are you dogfighting? Why are you not sending missiles? You're effectively sending missiles anyway. So the question there is you need adequate air defenses to deal with the Pakistani clear advances with Chinese equipment. But maybe for offensive operations, you need to be thinking about your missile capabilities. And the drones are also an interesting dynamic. I haven't quite got a fix on just how important they were in this particular battle, but it also seems like in terms of air defenses, S-400 probably did pretty well. I mean, that's at least how it looks to me at the outset, which isn't going to lead India to buy more non-Russian equipment if that stuff is still available. Just one to think about your other question. Look, it's a big story about Indian political economy matched up with Indian defense industry, which has created a mess, just like it's created here, right? This is you want efficiency, you don't have a political economy in which there are many other reasons to build the kind of things that you're building and buy the things that you buy that have nothing to do with military effectiveness. But that's frankly what we've been stuck with for many decades now. And we've overcome it to the extent that we have with massive expenditures and massive over expenditures. And India doesn't have that luxury, so that's why they're stuck where they are. That's a simple way of trying to explain a really complicated thing.
Final question up here, and then in your responses, when you respond to Akshob's, I'd ask you to give your final comments as well.
Thanks, Aparna. And of course, thanks to the great discussion. Just touching on some of the things you mentioned, particularly vis-a-vis the recent skirmish on Operation Sindoor, given a lot of you have all followed Pakistan for a long time, I was just curious, on April 22nd, the big T word that everyone was worried about were tariffs. And now it's sort of, as Steve Cohen prophesies, it's a 100-year war. Given that since 2019, since Article 370, the India-Pakistan thing was almost, not forgotten, but at the back burner. And it almost seems cyclical that every few years there's always a skirmish and this raised the specter. And since, Lisa, you touched on Balakot, we've seen Bombay and Shiv Shankar's Menon doctrine of restraint. Is that now gone out of the window since we saw Balakot and the dogfight that happened, and now with the Pahalgam attacks? Is this now where the precedent has been set that any small thing, this is how they're going to raise, New Delhi is going to react this way?
Yeah, I think it's clear from Prime Minister Modi's speech that he made on Monday that any attack, whether they know for a fact that it's, supported by the Pakistan military, they're going to assume so, and they'll retaliate. So I think they have lowered the threshold for their response, their military response to Pakistan. That seems quite clear, that the anger has risen to an extent where the tripwire is much closer, and you can see this in sort of the progression of the response of the Modi government ever since they came into power in 2014. It's gotten progressively more serious, any response to a terrorist attack. 2015, Uri, 2016. Pathankot, the surgical strikes, 2019, a strike deep into Pakistani territory. Now, 2025, 9 strikes, both in Pakistani Kashmir and the Punjab province on what India says is terrorist infrastructure. And in fact, we all know that the headquarters of Lashkar-e-Taiba is in Muradkay. We know the headquarters of Jaish-e-Mohammed is in Bahawalpur. We saw, a terrorist, Abdur Azhar, who was behind the IC-814 hijacking of the Indian Airlines in 1999. He was killed in the strike, major terrorist. India finally, got justice for that. Should have happened a long time ago. What I'm saying is Pakistan should have done something about the terrorists on their territory. So yes, I think that the stakes are higher now. We see what's possible. We had 4 days of a lot of military activity, drones flying back and forth, missiles flying back and forth, military bases being struck, religious sites. I mean, this is something that we wouldn't have really thought possible, 20 years ago. because it shows risk. The risk tolerance has lowered. I mean, they're willing to tolerate a lot more risk and even potential nuclear exchange. It looks like I think there was a lot more concern about respecting red lines, but it seems that Indian anger has risen to an extent where they've just decided that we're not going to allow ourselves to be, under nuclear blackmail, which is basically what Prime Minister Modi said. So yeah, we're in a different phase. We're not out of the woods yet. We keep hearing this is a pause in the military activity, and I do think that the U.S. will need to remain engaged in terms of getting both sides to respect the ceasefire and to keep that in place. That's a fine distinction. The U.S. cannot resolve the Kashmir issue, but the U.S. does have to be involved in keeping the two countries back from the brink of war.
What's, I think, going to be interesting to watch, clearly the Prime Minister's statement, it's intended as a form of deterrence, but my question is, will that work? Will it actually deter Pakistan? And even if the Pakistani state takes that at face value as something that, perhaps we should get more serious then about this issue, and I question whether that's where we're going to head, do they even have the capability right now to successfully do what they would need to do to really wipe out some of the terrorist activity that operates pretty freely within Pakistan? I mean, TTP attacks and other things have been up significantly. So I question whether you're actually going to see the Pakistani state willing or capable of really ratcheting down extremist activity to the degree that you would need in order to prevent any more cross-border attacks. And so then if that happens, are we just in a cycle where we're going to see more of this?
So I'm not sure what the Indian equivalent of walking and talking and chewing gum at the same time is. Maybe drinking tea and enjoying a wonderful Bollywood film or something along those lines. But my point is that I think the United States and India are going to have to be going forward in an environment where we do multiple things at once. And so as Lindsey pointed out earlier, there will always be another crisis du jour, and that can't derail the relationship. I would like to leave you guys with two quick thoughts. One, just to reiterate that it's easy to stand up and point to potential deliverables in joint statements. At our work at ORF America on the tech policy side, sometimes finding the implementation, the nitty-gritty details, when you go back and talk to somebody about, well, how does this semiconductor early warning agreement that you reached, how does that actually work? Well, details sometimes are scarce, sometimes because it's classified, but other times because it just doesn't exist or because it doesn't survive a transition between administrations. The other one I really want to flag is that semiconductor and AI infrastructure cooperation between the United States under trust and compact between the United States and India is not inevitable. It's going to require a lot of work. We're going to have to navigate barriers and export controls. India is going to need to pick up the slack on improving its non-tariff barriers. And I would close with the U.S. thought. I mean, can we, the United States, reestablish a credible trade policy? Can we retain the leadership of our research universities, which have been amazing for decades? Can we achieve an immigration policy that continues to welcome talented people from all over the world and allow them to travel and work all over the world? These things are not a given to me, and I think our leaders will need to collaborate to ensure that the investment environment in both countries remains attractive for the private sector. Thank you.
Yeah, so just on the India-Pakistan business, it does seem like we've entered actually a different chapter in this relationship. You talked about leaving a world of restraint. I think we left that a while ago. I think it's more a question of whether Prime Minister Modi will actually hold to his word that terrorist attacks on India are treated as conventional attacks, in which case you could have some kind of a low-level conventional fight going on for a very long time. And we used to think of war between India and Pakistan as land war. with air power involved. Now, with these other tools that we've been talking about, and to the extent that war is also, and we haven't gotten into this, but a matter of narrative, information, disinformation, claims, counterclaims. It's a political battle, right? War is politics by other means. This new kind of war between India and Pakistan could be a kind of a violent politics that persists in ways that I haven't thought too much about, because the tools have changed for conducting that war. So that's something to pay attention to. And then I would just go back to, again, my hobby horse on things like higher education. You just mentioned this. Research, this has been an area of tremendous American advantage, and which is also tremendously attractive to the rest of the world, which makes us an incredible potential partner for India, and which is the only way I perceive that, going back to Aparna, to your big question about how we would be confident in a relationship with India, if our higher education and research and development across the board were more linked up, and we had increasingly a sense that India was not just a kind of a distant partner, or even what we call it now, a strategic partner, but kind of a natural colleague in the way that it saw the world, and that we were so aligned in the way that we taught our children and taught our adults in college, and the way that we studied the world and thought about it, there would be a comfort level that I think doesn't exist. But that is, I think, a means to get there. But we won't get there if we don't have the kinds of investments that we've historically had in our own institutions, so I worry about that.
Thank you very much. I'd like you all to join me in thanking this excellent panel. Thank you very much.